and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Many thanks for coming to what I think is an important intellectual occasion and a great opportunity for us to discuss a topic of growing importance, and one which is always lurking in the background, but which is not always at the forefront. But now it is pushing its way to the forefront, and we are fortunate. And the topic is strategic autonomy. I would say myself that strategic autonomy is something that is, among other things, an adjustment to major developments in foreign policy, sometimes after a slight delay. The example I would give is that of the Suez crisis, which provoked, obviously, a serious reconsideration among Europeans of how they were going to react to the defeat of France and Britain, which is what it amounted to, at the hands not so much of Egypt, but at the hands of their ally, the United States of America, at the time close NATO ally, and one that had, however, different foreign policy interests, which it was clear, at least the interests, of course, are always a matter of dispute, but it was clear the American government had a different vision of how the West should deal with the Third World. And Britain and France came to different conclusions about how they should react to it. The French adopting the policy of trying to build up a European defense structure over the years. That's been a consistent theme of French foreign policy. The British deciding rather that they would remain more attached to the United States than before, and therefore to some extent subordinate their foreign policy interests to those of Washington. Now, we've recently had, beginning in 1989, a massive change in the structure of international power and international relations, with the demise of the Soviet Union and the various reactions to that, which have developed slowly over time, but are now, it seems to me, in the light of many other factors, namely the rise of China, have developed in a way that is forcing people to consider whether strategic autonomy is something that they need once again to worry about or not. And obviously it is the French and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who has spoken out most frequently and most loudly about this. But of course it's a factor in all European conversations, and one in which is causing no great changes yet, but frequent predictions of future great change. Now, this is obviously a complex and important topic. We're fortunate in having a speaker Dr. Hilton, who is an expert in this particular topic. And we also have two colleagues of mine to respond to him. Steve Hayward. Steve is he's a fellow here. He has several other academic positions, but I think he is very well known as someone who has written a 2-volume history of the Reagan administration, which itself had an enormous impact on global order and the reordering of global order. Eric, excuse me again. Sorry, Eric Hendricks, a sociologist, is also a fellow here. He's somebody who is specialized in looking at the impact of China's emergence on the structure of world authority. The topic which Dr. Root is addressing is the moral foundations of global order. And because he knows more about it than almost anybody else, I'm asking him if he'd like to address us.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very delighted to be here and honored to have been invited. And I will try to get back to the issue just raised about the moment in 1956 at the Suez crisis when England, the UK and France had to make a decision about the amount of strategic autonomy they would have in a new world system led by the United States. So I believe, as was stated, we are at a very similar moment in world history when countries that I would call periphery or secondary powers that have made assumptions about the way the world was have to now reorient themselves. And in that regard, I'm thinking of powers, secondary powers like India, like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. These are major countries that had a conception of how they were strategically oriented that has to be dramatically revived as a result of what we see today. So, as was also mentioned, I'm working on a book called Moral Foundations of Global Order, and the topic today will be one of the topics in the book. I call it When the Gods Quarrel. So the outline of this talk is that the United States and China are both unprepared for the reshaping of traditional paradigms in international relations, especially in the context of an increasingly multipolar world where hegemony is not a guaranteed equilibrium outcome. Both nations, based on their historical experiences and strategic viewpoints, have had their assumptions and their strategic frameworks challenged by the binding nature of globalization and the ensuing mutual dependencies. Neither has prepared itself for the limitations imposed by the changing structure of global networks, where the ability of any single actor to influence linkages within the system has been greatly reduced, and in which peripheral players will enjoy more degrees of freedom. So that's basically the outline of what I'm going to say today. Let me start with the first question, which is how much of what we see today is similar to the Cold War that we went through between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there are very striking and very important differences between these two scenarios, and they shouldn't be compared to each other. There are some elements that are reminiscent of the Cold War in US-China relations, but what's different is the intricacies of their relationship and the differences in the global context, which make the risks that we face in this particular geopolitical environment very different from those of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. What's the difference? Well, interconnectedness of the economies, not only upon each other, but on global value chains that neither economy could control. And so this adds a level of complexity that was not present in the US-Soviet rivalry. There are similarities. Both sides are very fearful of a global realignment that might be more favorable to a rival. And of course, to prevent that from happening, both sides are involved in a very intensive diplomatic offensive. And of course, you very much are aware of that, living in one of the countries that is considered most vulnerable to this environment. So the world economy fragments. Peripheral players are going to seek more degrees of freedom to gain a better position for themselves. And in this kind of environment, the diplomatic outreach of both China and the United States is going to cost more and actually accomplish less. So the goal will be for these two countries to try to understand that in the global landscape that we have today, no single actor is going to be able to influence linkages through unilateral actions. And so any grand strategy that any of these players would like to employ is going to have to take into account very significant limitations. And as you could probably see where I'm going, neither side is really prepared to accept what those limitations are. So during the Cold War, there was a certain resilience in diplomatic relations, and that was basically due to the fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union were willing to have forbearance towards their cultural and moral differences. And the same thing was true of U.S.-China relations in the 1950s and 1960s. People said, well, they're different from us and they're never going to be alike. And I'll talk a little bit more about how deep that sentiment was. Today, that sentiment has disappeared. And both of these countries in particular are trying to impose their cultural and moral values, not necessarily on each other, but on a world system that is evolving. So to find an analogy for this, I already told you I don't think the Cold War is very useful, but I do believe that Greek mythology offers an analogy. So that's why I call this talk When the Gods Quarrel, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this in this context. So in Greek mythology, the gods often quarreled with each other, and of course their conflicts had implications for individual freedom. The gods were powerful beings with control over different aspects of the world, just like China and the United States control different aspects of the world, different resource flows, et cetera, et cetera. And their actions can directly impact mortals. So we look at all these other countries as basically mortals. So there are multifaceted linkages, however, were a matter of conflict. And there had to be, in the Greek mind, a mechanism for maintaining order in the cosmos. And the Greeks understood the world as having an interconnected nature. And the gods played a role in a delicate balancing. And here are a few of the considerations regarding strategic autonomy in the context of quarrels among the gods. So one, divine interference. Gods quarrel, they interfere in mortal affairs, they manipulate events, they influence human lives directly. The Trojan War, of course, is a very good example of that. Two, favoritism and protection. So during the quarrels, the gods often took sides, bestowed favor on one side or the other. And those who gained the support of a powerful deity were likely to succeed in gaining or receiving protection. And of course, three would be divine punishment. The fear of retribution could restrict the freedom of mortals as they had to navigate their actions very carefully to avoid incurring the wrath of the gods. Four, the question of moral agency itself. Despite the gods' influence, Greek mythology also emphasized the agency and choice of mortals. Mortals were often portrayed as navigating a complex world where they had to consider both the influence of the gods and their own desires and ambitions. But mortals were able to make their own decisions, and they could, of course, try to play one god against the other. So within that context, there are limitations of power. The gods could impact and hurt each other, but there were limits. For example, gods could easily undo the actions of other gods without some form of retribution or consequence, but there were realms that were exclusive to one god or another, but there were also realms where their interventions would be met with resistance. Overall, the quarrels among the gods could shape the course of events, limit the freedom of action, but the one thing to bear in mind is the immortality of the gods implies an inherent indestructibility. They could not destroy each other, either in a literal or permanent sense. And this is exactly the situation between the United States and China. It's a point that I try to make as frequently as I can. No matter what happens, whether we have a war, a nuclear war, or any other kind of war, at the end, the United States will still be there, and China will still be there. They will be there forever. Neither side could ever destroy the other side. And we can talk about why that is. And it's interesting that when I talk to people who are in positions to make strategic decisions, they never bear in mind that they do not have ultimate power to erase or destroy their rival. So what did the Greeks think about in terms of the overall structure of the universe? Well, they had a concept of fate, and there was a shared knowledge of prophecies in Greek mythology that underscore the interconnectedness among the gods. And some of you may recall courses you took or books you've read. The fates, of course, were called morae, and they had a determining role in determining the destinies of both gods and mortals, creating a level of interconnectedness and mutual dependence as gods sought to understand, interpret, and occasionally manipulate their destinies. So the argument that I'm going to make is that China, much more than the United States, understood the fate. And the fates in today's world is really globalization. The United States was much less aware of the limitations of their power over globalization than the Chinese were. And therefore, in the last 40 years, China has probably benefited much more from globalization than the United States has. And that's because of how they assessed and how they read, just like the Greek gods, how they read the fates and how they understood globalization in this case. So today, United States policymakers are scurrying to compensate for their lack of preparedness, and the world that they currently face was not the world that they anticipated. So let's talk about the fundamental miscalculations that the United States made, and what they miscalculated was China's fundamental strategic orientation. The first mistake that American policymakers made was that they tended to believe that they could own and control globalization, that globalization was something that was emanating from the United States, and that how it would unfold in the third world or non-Western domains could be controlled or dictated by rules or principles dictated from Washington. The second mistake was to believe that the laws of the market would prevail over thousands of years of autocracy. And these presumptions underpin the conditions placed on China for its entry into the WTO. The West did not appreciate that due to its size and internal unity, China might be able to engineer, quote, the Sinicization of globalization. The repercussions of that miscalculation continue to magnify over time. So the word Sinicization is extremely critical in this conversation. China explicitly stated its intentions to access the global marketplace for the purpose of self-strengthening. This is conveniently disregarded by Western intellectuals during the 1990s. They wanted to believe that interconnectedness would put China on the path to liberal democracy, and this was the load-bearing assumption of US global development policy. It's proven to be extremely erroneous, and it marks a giant reversal from US policies in the 50s and 60s. Then, as now, China was an opponent of the American vision of human rights and global order. But the idea that China could be liberated from its 4,000 years of authoritarian centralization was deemed unrealistic by the scholars who I studied with, most particularly my mentor, John Fairbank. Some of you may know his work, but he repeated consistently that nothing any foreign power could do could change the essence of what China was. So what we have is the reversal of China's economic policies during the 1980s, which nurtured expectations that it was on a path towards greater alignment with Western values. And where did the Westerners get this idea from? Obviously only from talking among themselves, because during the entire period, any Chinese document that you could find will have reiterated the word zhongti xiyong, which means Chinese learning for fundamentals, Western learning for practical applications. Let me repeat it. Chinese learning for fundamentals and Western learning for practical application. In other words, the Chinese were only interested in practical applications of Western technology, not things that fundamentally concerned themselves as a civilization and as a form of social organization. So they advocated, back in the Qing dynasty, taking Western technology into China, but in a way that it would not change the imperial system. Now, those of you who know about Communist China's policies, it's exactly the same logic that brought China into accessing the global economy, beginning with Deng Xiaoping. The phrase that Deng Xiaoping used was "Liyang Watsi." It means taking advantage of foreign investments. It does not imply an enduring commitment to any foreign values. China never intended to open its market for equal access for foreign enterprises, let alone to foreign ideas about governance. So what was the idea that China had? The idea that they had was to harness globalization's what was called inexorable logic for self-strengthening. Every phrase that you will find in Chinese literature, in Chinese policy proclamations, points to that logic. China and the US evidently had very different ideas about how to approach globalization. So China approached globalization with austerity, collective effort, and a philosophy of self-limitation. It continued to affirm that its cultural differences would not allow it to align its institutions with those of the West, and that it never intended to tear down the walls, but only to open the door, but with the key in its own hand. Now, you can look at the phrases, actually, the westernization of movement, 1861 to 1895, foreign learning for self-renewal, repurposed by Mao Zedong, exactly the same phrase, turning foreign things to China's service, then Deng Xiaoping's open door policy, and now Xi Jinping's China-centric notion of what you may have heard, dual circulation, which basically means separating the domestic economy from the export economy. And this is why, in my opinion, and many economists believe, China is in the situation it's in today with facing a very severe economic downturn, much more severe than anybody in the West wants to talk about or anybody in China wants to admit. So let's just look a little bit at what China did to integrate itself into the global economy. Well, it opened up investment zones, free trade zones, it opened up special economic zones, it opened up high-tech development zones. It basically was following a policy which was called in Chinese birdcage economy. In other words, the bird was going to be kept in the cage, and the bird was Western investment. And the word birdcage economy is consistently there. in all of the Chinese writings on this topic. So I'll just say very briefly, I mentioned Sinization. So Buddhism came to China from India. It took 500 years before it was Sinicized, before it was accepted. And then it was really something quite different from what it originated as. Marxism came into China, but Chinese Marxism is a Sinicized version. It has very little to do with German Marxism or Russian Marxism, and we can have a scholarly discussion about that. But the point I want to make is that globalization has also been Sinicized, and it's been Sinicized according to a logic which is consistent with how China has faced other foreign entities or other foreign ideas or expedient exigencies. So when China started to consider joining the WTO, which eventually joined in 2001, repeatedly in the 15th Party Congress preceding this, the phrase that was used was a socialist market economy, and the access to the global economy would be with the long-term goal of strengthening the socialist Marxist economy. And of course, the Chinese didn't exactly know what this meant. But what they understood is the following, and this came directly from American writings on the global economy that were prominent in the 1970s. They saw multiple push-pull forces that prompted the massive relocation of production from the developed world to big emerging economies that would be open to the globalization process. This included environmental and labor movements that were growing in the West that would make it very difficult for the Western companies to produce goods. And so basically the West was experiencing a condition of market saturation. So in order to overcome this, they needed to reduce the cost of manufacturing, and what made this possible was the reduction in transportation and communication costs that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s. So now it made it possible for Western economies to move to places where there were abundant low-cost labor and lax environmental standards and weak unions. And of course, China saw this as its opportunity. Opportunity it understood not to create entirely new industries in China, like as the Japanese and the Koreans had done earlier. They understood that the challenge was to integrate China into global value chains and to make China an indispensable part of those global value chains. And it's exactly what they did. The strategy was draw the multinational corporations, the NMCs, into joint ventures with Chinese partners to provide a shortcut to obtaining capital, technology, management skills, and export channels. Technology for market access, that was the phrase that repeatedly appeared in Chinese documents. It was a deliberate strategy, and it was a very intelligent strategy designed to use market access as a bargaining chip to induce technology transfers from MNCs into China. Most MNCs were very happy to do this. They would swap soft assets for equity positions in joint ventures, or bundle their manufacturing knowledge with equipment for a package transaction. There was no other way to get into the China market. It enabled Chinese companies to catch up very, very quickly in record time with world levels of advanced technology and brand recognition. And of course, there was a pollination effect. The MNCs contributed to Chinese entrepreneurship, and most of the Chinese entrepreneurs were in fact people who were trained in Western companies. And people who study this, you can see a one-to-one relationship between the spread of entrepreneurialism and the origins of the entrepreneurs having been basically tutored or trained in a Western company before going off and starting their own company. So I remember, I also teach in China. I always ask my students in China, most of whom are Western educated, Chinese, not most, but many working for Western companies. I always say, what is your goal? And the goal is always to start their own company after 10 years. Now, a lot of them don't actually ever get there. But when they go into a Western company, it's not because they want to rise in that company, it's because they want to create a Chinese version of that company that they then could be the master of. So let me move to the next topic, which is, before I get to the next topic, let me say one last thing about Xi Jinping. So we have this end of history narrative in the West, which asserts that Western technology and science are embedded with Western values and social norms. And this is a very challenging notion to the Chinese, and they've now formulated and articulated very cohesively and coherently an alternative view, which is a community of shared future for mankind. And this concept is rooted in the notion that all under heaven are one family, and it's a worldview where each civilization has its own contribution to make. And it's also the notion of a more inclusive worldview that would balance East and West. But the way that this balancing would occur is that the human rights criteria and values of the West would be thrown out the door. And that the knowledge, the human rights criteria that would be put in its place would be relevant to the level of development of the country. So for example, if the country had a level of underdevelopment, then if it employed slavery to get there, then it would be perfectly reasonable, because that's exactly how the United States, according to the Chinese, got to where it is. So this would be an idea of cultural relativism, and it very much drives the Chinese vision of human rights. So let me just remind those of you who don't know John Fairbank. In 1966, he said, some form of Chinese authoritarian centralism is going to be with us for the foreseeable future, and we're going to have to learn to live with it. And then we go into the period of up until 2013. People didn't believe that. We thought there was a Francis Fukuyama version of international development where China would become a democracy. Well, I don't think anyone believes that. Maybe there are some people who believe that in this room, but I don't run into people like that very often. So let me talk about freedom of action in a more fragmented world to move forward to the actual topic here. Chinese self-strengthening has reshaped the global order. And it's created a much more complex international environment with a multifaceted and multi-dimensional conflict dynamics, which is very different from the conflict dynamics of the Cold War itself. The most important of these, of course, is the conflict, tension between the United States and China. And now the question is, how does that or does it not create economic opportunities for strategic autonomy for peripheral or secondary powers? They want to navigate the balance in such a way that they can derive the most benefit for themselves. It's only natural that they should want to do that. So some states may choose to not align completely with either power. They will try to maintain a relationship with both. They will try to obtain benefits from both sides. They will try to avoid a complete dependency on one or the other. We can talk about which countries are in that category, maybe during the discussion. Some smaller countries won't be able to do that, so they're going to strengthen their military capabilities or form new alliances. They may do this to balance against the growing military power of China. You see this going on very, very systematically in Southeast Asia in a way that I think none of us would have anticipated, because I teach a course on Southeast Asia. I've been doing it since 1996. There was no movement towards integration among those countries. Now it's happening on a daily basis, and we know what's driving it. The countries that we're really interested in are India, Russia, the European Union. These are the bigger groups, clusters, and we want to think about how the new dynamics will influence their strategic portfolios. So I can give you a bunch of examples of this, but because I want to move as quickly as possible into the discussion itself, into the give and take, let me just say that US policy of so-called friendshoring or moving supply chains to countries out of China may actually create some opportunities for these countries to be autonomous. It also creates great opportunities for China. Most of the friendshoring is actually just moving China's investments out of China into Mexico, into Malaysia, into Vietnam. So for example, there's been an massive influx of Chinese investment into Mexico. That means that it's creating an intermediation of Chinese capital, but it's not necessarily supplanting the role of China. It's just changing the dynamics a little bit. Friendshoring is not going to have the result of bypassing China. That's the point. And I think most people who think about this and look at the data realize that this is true. But what we are going to see is, and the IMF has been talking about this repeatedly, that we're going to see geopolitical, geoeconomic fragmentation. And that's going to have a cost. The cost is what you see, someone mentioned the other day, just in the region above Armenia. There are going to be lots of scenarios where things are going to happen that none of the great powers are going to be able to influence, and a lot of these things are going to have very damaging repercussions in the world economy. We're going to see economic fragmentation. It's going to have a cost. What is the cost? Well, IMF has spent a lot of time trying to measure it. Depending on which scenario prevails, the cost is going to be 2 to 10% of global GDP. Who's going to pay that price? Basically third world countries, the countries that can least afford it. Other countries will be more vulnerable than others. The United States will not be very vulnerable to this. It will have no real effect on the United States, but it will have a tremendous effect on countries in Africa and elsewhere, and that, of course, will have secondary consequences for the United States, but not direct consequences. So I'll remind you that in the world of classical antiquity, there were two great powers, Athens and Sparta, and they both believed that the demise of one would be the triumph of the other. Of course, you've already, I think many of you have classical education. You know that the conflict led both to become less efficient and weaker, and ultimately both declined. Hence, it is said that the tears of Athens are not the joys of Sparta. I'm not going to end with that. There's still more to be said, a lot more, but I just want to go back to the fact that the potential US-China conflict is not like the Cold War conflict, and the more we think about it, the more we become aware of the fact that it has its own special set of risks. And I'll just go remind you of what these risks are. When you're decoupling, you can incur blame or responsibility for disruptions in the other country, which can be viewed as aggressions. And as I said, I just came back from China, and I had a lot of seminars with Chinese leaders on this topic, and they specifically viewed what we would call decoupling as aggression. They said, these things that you're doing are hurting us, and therefore we interpret this as a form of what they call capital aggression. And they also call it rhetorical aggression. Lots of phrases I hadn't heard before. But there's a reason for this, because when you have intensely or highly integrated economies and you start to separate them, you're going to have tit-for-tat retaliations, as we've been seeing. And the loss of efficiency or economic output on one side, or the increase of inflationary pressures or increased unemployment, can be blamed on the action of a rival. And that's exactly what's happening in China. All of the issues that I would attribute to their failed economic policies, they attribute to economic aggression by the United States. They don't take responsibility for the fact that their strategies to become a high-income country make no sense. They want to do the same thing they did to get from low to middle-income status to get to higher income status, but instead they're going to go down rather than up. They don't want to take responsibility for that. They blame it on U.S. aggression. So there is the possibility that of conflict or different conflict scenario than there was during the Soviet Union, because as we pull apart, there's going to be mutual recrimination of that kind. So let me just conclude by going back to the Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, fate dictated by the Moirae bound gods in mutual understanding of the limitations of their policies and of their powers. We're not yet there with the United States and China. Even Zeus, the king of gods, was subject to the rules of fate, creating a sense of mutual acknowledgement, both among the gods and between the gods and the mortals, of the boundaries of divine influence and manipulation. The binding nature of globalization will have an analogous influence on global political economy and on the relationship of China and the United States. So let's have a conversation about this. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that. I think what we'll do is we'll have a conversation here for a few minutes, and then eventually we'll throw it open to audience questions and comments. Oh gosh, a lot to work there. I think maybe I have pulled together from my reporter's notebook maybe 4 follow-up questions to draw more out from you. And also from Eric, because you've lived in China, and I think both of you have probably forgot more about China than I have ever known. But I think I've got 4, it might only be 3, but one might have a couple of parts. The whole business about the strategy of self-strengthening of China through its exploitation of markets and technology, it connects to the question of one of the differences between the Cold War and today. You know, Lenin famously said, I think, that the capitalists will sell us the rope that we use to hang them with. It seems to me the Chinese strategic version of this is the capitalists will finance the rope factory in China to manufacture the rope we will hang them with. But one of the things that you didn't mention, although I think you kind of hinted at it in a way that's different about the Cold War and today, is, you know, the Cold War, actually even before the Cold War and carrying into it, you had in the West a culture in academia, in literary circles, and intellectual circles that was pro-communist and for a long time pro-Soviet. And until that became untenable, but it was still pro-Marxist. I don't think I detect any pro-Chinese Western sentiment in the same caliber or character that you had in the long decades of the Cold War. I mean, the closest you can come, I think, are those pathetic columns by Tom Friedman, where he says, I'd love to be China for a day, because isn't their authoritarianism awesome for solving problems, right? Those are always, even he doesn't do that much anymore. But so the 2 questions are, what survives in any serious way of the old Marxist ideology, which you mentioned they always adapted into a Chinese way? And the specific question related to that is about President Xi. Is a lot of people in the West seem to think, well, he's different. He represents a throwback or a reversal of this hoped for liberalization that you mentioned. And I wonder if you think that's correct. Or is he really a surprise, or is he really something that you would have expected? I think you're shaking your head. Okay.
Well, I will let you answer that.
Why don't you go ahead? Because I've
okay.
been a lot, so you evidently have a view on that, and I'd like to hear it.
Well, obviously there was no, as you already mentioned during the talk, there was no serious drive towards liberalization or liberal democratization in China before Xi Jinping came around. And of course, Xi Jinping was actually following in trends that have already been set in the Communist Party leadership since 2008, 2009, financial crisis there was a move, as I've been told, when I lived in Beijing, I talked to European diplomats, and they say 2008, 2009, there was a clear change in tone in the Chinese leadership, because they felt that they had been vindicated. America was fake. Its finance was fake. Its society, its political ideology had been shown to be fake. Apparently, now they have, of course, them being in the tradition of Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, and in the broader tradition of Marxism-Leninism, they were always eager to draw that conclusion anyway. But there was some real. Earlier, there had been some real modesty and also insecurity on the part of Chinese leaders, because a lot of them actually felt that maybe their political system was not compatible with the 21st century. 2008, 2009 was a big change in tone, and Xi Jinping just followed the trend, so to speak, but it took Westerners a few years to catch on to that change tone in China, and then they attributed it to Xi Jinping, whose role was then overestimated in fact. And interestingly enough, there's a parallel with Russia and Turkey, when you also saw 2008, 2009 as a crucial turning point insofar as in the tone and the intensity of the anti-Western sentiments. So, but maybe I think that was in line with the statements you made previously.
I agree. Not working. Oh, it is. Okay. Yeah, I agree very much. I haven't mentioned it. I'm glad that you did. In 2008, there was a book by Henning. You know this book about the decline of the United States, and
Wang Huning,
Wang Huning.
1991.
Yeah,
America
but it wasn't
Against
taken
America.
very seriously when he first wrote it. People didn't. Now he's become basically a member of the Politburo, and he is clearly the brains behind and the influence behind much of Xi Jinping's own writings or thought. And the idea here is, as you said, that after 2008, the Chinese saw the financial crisis and interpreted this as a crisis of capitalism and a crisis of the United States. And they turn increasingly to this logic of Huning, that the United States and the West does not have cultural unity any longer, and the cohesiveness of the society is collapsing. The ability of the society to make sacrifices and to act cohesively and cooperatively is eroding. And so the new strategy of China is to feed and promote not Marxism, because they know that would be targeted, but to support anybody in American academe who is describing the polarization or the, as you said, the phoniness of American exceptionalism or meritocracy. So there are a lot of actual writers in America and in Canada who attack meritocracy and who attack the underlying integrity of American institutions, and these people are being funded rather than Marxists. See, Marxism will immediately be a red flag, and they understand that. So what they are trying to do is support research agendas in the academy that feature the story of American decline, and therefore can, in fact, aid and continue to precipitate that decline and to cause a loss of self-confidence. And of course, then to say America is not worthy of leading the world, they have this, the loss of self-confidence is apparent even from their own writings, from their own thinking. Look at these prominent academics who are all saying that the American polity is fracturing, that it's becoming unviable. When I was in China just a few weeks ago, I actually heard people say in seminars that Americans were packing their bags, they were moving to Canada, that California and New York were on the verge of secession. The United States would fall apart, and therefore the United States is not worthy of global leadership, and only China can really help the world achieve stability. And this may sound very far-fetched. I heard this in forums of very, very high-ranking discussion and people. And they said to me, well, please don't report that people were saying this. But nobody disagreed with it when it was being said. And it goes right back to the thing that you're saying. So there is this other component that China is, and I think it speaks to also the question you raised, in American academe, there are people who are perpetuating China's agenda, but they're not doing it by being Marxist. They're doing it by documenting, chronicling the disintegration of America.
Yeah. So, that leads to a second domain. I was really thrilled to hear you pile on to the end of history hypothesis. I never understood why that caught on the way it did. And you're right. I don't think anyone really believes it. But I thought at the time that what people were getting wrong was it wasn't an end to leftist radicalism, maybe in the end of the Soviet Union, but in fact, it had the effect of liberating radical thought from the anchor of being associated with a foreign enemy power, an enemy bloc. And so what you just described, I think, is entirely harmonious with what I'm suggesting here, which is now the manifestation of that domestically. I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't paid attention, I should have, to what you were just saying about American academics. Their version of this is more self-critical of us. Okay, there was something else you mentioned. There was another big think thesis in the late 80s, before the end of history, that has been coming back to mind, and a couple of your comments sharpen it, which is, I'm sure you remember it, it was Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers in the late 80s. United States was in danger of imperial overstretch. And part of that was we have too many foreign commitments. Our fiscal situation is getting out of whack. We can't afford this international empire. And of course, what happened was, in the short run, that seems to have been falsified by events. The Cold War ended. The 90s were hugely prosperous for the world. But now suddenly, and by the way, there's a Suez link to what you and John used to introduce the panel. Now we're back into that problem in America. Our fiscal situation is terrible and getting worse by the day. We have a lot of commitments, including, and I want to ask a question in a few minutes about the Taiwan, which you didn't mention, but we have all these commitments. I wonder if Ukraine might end up being Suez in reverse, and I can explain what I mean by all of that. But I wonder, and then you said neither China or America are, how did you put it? I forget, but it seemed consonant with the imperial overstretch problem, that neither one of us our reach exceeds our grasp. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yes. I think everything you said is true. Both countries today are overreaching and overbidding and overstating their case. And the inflammatory implications of this is extremely dangerous, and Taiwan is a very good example of this. But you made a lot of points, so
Sorry.
I got to try to...
Pick any one you want. You don't have to do them all.
Right. So what was the point you made just before the last one?
Well, the imperial overstretch problem. Well, I was putting my foot down also to agree with you on the end of history.
Yeah, so the end of history story, well, it was always an anathema to the Chinese. And they very diligently constructed an alternative story. And as I said in one of my remarks, the alternative story is probably closer to realism, and it enabled the Chinese to engage in accessing the global economy in a way that was probably more realistic and more successful in terms of achieving their long-term goals than the U.S. approach, which now has to be reconsidered. The U.S. now has to say, well, the end of history isn't going to happen, and we now have a new form of rival, and now we have to recalibrate and recalculate our economic policies. And oh yeah, you mentioned the deficit, so I do want to comment on that. So that's the one thing that in China they don't seem to see. And I was find this very interesting because that's a weakness in the United States that has ramifications that could be extremely harmful to China. Because if the U.S. reaches a fiscal cliff and can't repay or live up to the payment of the Treasury bonds and can't sustain the dollar, then all bets are off in China. And so they don't think about that. But in terms of the U.S. being able to achieve any of its domestic or foreign policy goals, they will have to achieve a new fiscal compromise. Now, that will involve much more intrusive taxation, and that will have to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe in the next 12 months. But that's a solvable problem. Although it's a very big problem, it's not a problem that is greater than the means. The means are there, the resources are there, the revenues are there. It would just take a consensus, a political consensus to achieve. So that problem is a solvable problem. I don't know that China's long-term problems are as easily solvable.
Oh, yeah, I have more questions about all that. But Eric, did you want to weigh in on any of that grab bag of things I threw up in the
Well, I'll
confetti?
let you go one more time or 2 more times.
Okay.
And then I'll weigh in.
I'm always a sucker for Athens and Sparta analogies. Oh, no, not at all. And of course, the parallel I would draw is, as everyone knows, is China is on a very extensive armaments buildup. Formidable navy they're putting out in the water, some advanced weapons that I hear from people who know these things could essentially push our navy out of the Western Pacific if they want to. And okay, I know you've heard of the war games that have been done on how this might play out, and it's all very bad. And we're trying to, as you also made reference, with the Australians and the Japanese and the Koreans, and we're all trying to. It sounds also like Germany and England before World War I with the German naval buildup. Here's my thought experiment. Everything revolves around right now Taiwan. Will they or won't they? And what will we do? The thought experiment is, suppose there's no Taiwan issue. Suppose there's no Taiwan. Do whatever thought experiment you want. What then is, and maybe it makes no difference, but we're focusing on that and maybe missing what you're saying are the really fundamental problems. So what then becomes the focus of the problem? Or maybe think about it. Maybe we start thinking about it more clearly if Taiwan weren't distracting us.
Yeah, so Taiwan, the strategic stuff is way out of my lane, as they say these days. And I'm not even going to try to pretend that I understand those issues. I interpret the Taiwan issue very, very differently than the strategic guys do. Or the military guys do. Taiwan is a moral dilemma, more than even a strategic dilemma. Why? Because the claims, the legitimacy of those claims that China is making over Taiwan are not legitimate in terms of the UN system or world politics today. Their claim that they have some inherent right to determine the destiny of a population where they only 12% want unification are very, very weak. And we have to wake up to this. This is a moral battle, not unlike the one in the Ukraine, where on the basis of some fictitious historical argument, because Taiwan was only a part of China during some part of its history, and that was when China was not even existed, because it was under the Qing dynasty, which was a foreign dynasty. The legitimacy of that claim is based on a moral argument that most of us would reject if it was, let's say, the English saying, well, North America was part of England, so you really belong to us. That was about 200 years ago, at the same time when Taiwan was part of China. Or if the English or the UK was to say, well, Ireland, you were part of us during imperial times, during dynastic times, so you have no right to be a separate country. But you see, in terms of the international system, the legal framework of that system, and which is based on moral foundations, that argument has no legitimacy. And at some point, someone has to say, this is a country that's doing you no harm, that's totally capable of governing itself, and it's done so extraordinarily well, and it has a much higher per capita income than you guys have. What is the basis of your claim?
That will infuriate I'll use the old-fashioned phrase, the mainland Chinese, won't it?
I don't know. See, the problem is that now raises the argument to something that China can't completely disavow, which is that they do believe in human rights. They say they do. So let's elevate it to that level and not just make it a strategic issue of, you know, how many tanks or how many battleships do you have, but what moral authority do you have in this?
Yeah, I do a lot of writing and teaching on human rights, and one of the things I have in my file are the various things American presidents say when they go to China in the last 20 years. Presidents of both parties, and they will often say something like, the Chinese and Americans, we have different conceptions of human rights, which then makes a whole hash of the thing. Okay, that's just an observation. Sort of one more big thematic question, and I think I'm going to have you answer it first, Eric, and then we will turn to audience questions and comments. I'll reframe a couple of things that you said this way, or restate them this way. It seems to me that the idea that the open markets and trade would lead to liberalization in China. I mean, I knew Milton Friedman pretty well, and he was absolutely convinced that's what was going to happen. And, you know, he died. I think he was having some second thoughts about that at the time. He died around 2007. But that now is, as you point out, is thought to be implausible. And I think that is a crisis for, so I'd say the old liberal idea for us. There's a crisis for our side that's different from the one the Chinese observed to you, which is our polarization and all the chaos in America. That's, you know, quite true. The other thing that goes along with it. Oh, of course.
That.
Right. Yeah,
you know, it's like, do we really want to give that up?
No.
I mean, that's like part of our entertainment.
Yeah.
I mean, do we take it as seriously as foreign observers do as an indication of decline? No.
Right.
It's just like a sport.
Right. Yes, of course.
And some people like it.
Right. But what I was getting at is our confidence in the universality of liberal values, it seems to me, ought to be shaken by the moment that we've arrived at. And there's a lot more to that story, of course. The related question, or maybe subsidiary, is decoupling. That's the big phrase these days, and I'm old enough to remember.
It's not the big phrase. The U.S. dropped decoupling. I've examined every official document. They went to de-risking, and now the phrase that appears in all official documents is strategic interdependence with an adversary, or something to that effect. So it's really been very, very tempered down.
Well, all right. Well, what I'm wondering about is, does this represent the end of, you know, the idea of interdependence, which you can trace back at least to Kant and the level of theory and the level of more practical doctrine? Back in the 70s, where we were going to reduce Cold War tensions with interdependence. We were going to fix the problems in the Middle East with interdependence. The Soviet Union gas pipelines, which then became the Russian Nord Stream pipelines and so forth. That was going to help us by making us interdependent, and it's a part of the globalization story. And that's my point.
Now we know it's wrong, because first of all, now we've reinterpreted the British-German situation, the Japanese-American situation on the eve of Pearl Harbor. We now know that when you have interconnectivities, what I said at the end, but I haven't, is you have new risks of decoupling, has strategic risks of creating a tit-for-tat kind of dynamic that can get out of hand very easily, right? So I think the notion, I think people now in Washington, where I live in particular, are now recognizing this new set of risks. And the problem that people in Washington have is they can't give up on liberal internationalism. They can't give up on Wilsonian internationalism. It's visceral, and they're willing to make some adaptations around it. But as a driving theme, as a unifying theme of U.S. foreign policy, they can't give it up. I actually ask my classes every semester at the end of the class, can you face a world where international liberal ideals and moralism isn't the driving force of American foreign policy and of American overseas engagement? And they all say, absolutely not. Without that, we don't engage. That is the basis of our engagement.
Eric, do you want to weigh in on either that question? Well, pick anyone you want. Do you want to weigh in on any part of that just passed?
Oh no, I wanted to fly in my own questions. Shall I proceed with that? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I first wanted to thank you, Professor Root, for your excellent analysis, powerful analysis that you offered here today. I think you clearly identified some of the common misconceptions about China. Now, I've lived in China for 6 years. I worked at Peking University, and I'm a sociologist, and I like to do comparative case studies that relate to China. So I'm often described as a China expert by some people, and that's 100% false. And China experts doesn't really exist. It's like being a Western civilization expert. I mean, no one can live up to that. But most of the times, there's a topic that relates to China. I think, I know too little. I know too little to talk about this topic. It's just such a daunting topic. I can't speak about it. But then I look at the level of the public discourse about the topic, and then I think, well, if that's the level of the public discourse, then I'm going to weigh in on this. Because there's so many basic things that the public discourse, even at fairly high, semi-expert level, gets wrong. And you noted a few of those points. So, for instance, you noted the basic fact that neither side, neither America nor China, can push the other side of the map. And you think that's 1 + 1 is 2. There's nothing there. But as you mentioned, strategic thinkers, strategists, professional strategists, people who get paid to strategize, will have as an assumption that somehow the other side can be pushed off the map, which is an absolutely basic fallacy, which you. And then you mentioned that from the very start, the Communist Party has always tried to modernize without adopting the liberal democracy. In fact, that's been its main project from the very beginning. And despite that being in all the policy documents that the Chinese have published over the last 3 years, and that anyone who has ever looked seriously at what the Chinese government was intending to do, knew they wanted to avoid at all costs liberal democracy. And still, as you mentioned, because Westerners and scholars and intellectuals were talking with themselves, among themselves, could somehow miss this crucial fact. Now, you also interestingly mentioned the phrase Xiyong Zhongti, which means Western. It means Western use. Chinese, and the word for China in Chinese is Zhongguo, Central Kingdom, so central core. And it shows that the things that were from the West, the technologies, the scientific know-how was to be incorporated without touching the cultural and religious core of China. And this was actually, ironically enough, the new culture movement in the beginning of the 20th century moved a little bit against this in the Chinese context, because they said, well, actually, the Western power doesn't fully rely on just a bit of technological and scientific know-how. It relates to how Western societies are organized. And the way they're organized relates to their culture. So we need a much more holistic approach to learning from the West in order to modernize. And it was the early communists that were part of this trend. So actually the early communists actually moved away from this sense that you could just copy a little bit of superficial things from the West, some technology, and keep the cultural core. But what was going to be then the new core? Marxism, Leninism, of course. So, but ironically, then when the Maoism diluted under Deng Xiaoping, they turned again to this more traditional 19th century idea of we already know what kind of cultural core we should have, but now we're just going to adopt the technology and scientific know-how opportunistically, and in extension use the international institutions opportunistically. But the new core, of course, is Chinese socialism, socialism with Chinese characteristics. So yeah, those are just extreme. There are these extremely basic misinterpretations about China that are around, and that you tackled, I think, very effectively. Now, at the end of your talk, and here's where my question comes in, you mentioned that the Chinese are also sketching. They have a different new outlook, or they're trying to sketch a new outlook on where the international order should go, and it is compatible potentially with a sense of geopolitical realism, but its core is still a form of idealism. So it has this sense of this common future for humanity. And you mentioned the whole family, everything under heaven, one family, Chensha. Now I'm looking at these Chinese ideologues, these philosophers, these political thinkers, from Zhang Shigong, Zhao Tingyang, Xu Jilin, these thinkers in China that are on an academic level trying to conceptualize this. And then on the level of the party, you have pronouncements such as that one, Xi Jinping's new global civilization initiative, which he launched earlier this year, where he got foreign delegates to China to celebrate the rise of a new multi-civilizational order, where all the civilizations and cultures are equal and going to live in harmony while respecting each other's own autonomy. But of course, where does the wisdom from this global structure come from? The Chinese sense of harmony. So they kind of self-essentialize their tradition and then say this is going to be the overarching structure. Now, this is all very good, but you also mentioned that it's not really being picked up outside the West. Now, this is to the detriment of American intellectuals and strategists thinking about China. However, there's also something more going on. China doesn't seem to be a very powerful communicator, especially not compared to the United States. So aren't we seeing the emergence of a multipolar world order, but where the forms of power are asymmetrically divided? So China is by far the largest industrial producer. But America has a unique power through its journalism, through its education, through its political narratives to shape how people around the world interpret the world. So it has enormous cultural and intellectual influence, and the Chinese, for structural reasons and for cultural reasons, on a very deep level, seem not really to be able to compete with that. So rather, doesn't this match very well with your God analogy, where different gods, they fight among each other, but they also have their own domains. Poseidon is the king, is the god of the sea, right? So isn't that where we're going? Aren't we going to multipolar order with an asymmetry of powers, where America is going to be ruling over the immaterial side, culture, journalism, education, political narratives, and the Chinese, despite their new attempts to reconceptualize world order, are going to be the country of hard material power, of industrial production. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. In the last 6 months, 4 U.S. Ministers of state, cabinet ministers went to China. And not a single Chinese of that level has visited the United States. And and my students and others ask me this, because I've written about it in the media. Why don't they come? The answer is very simple. They can't come because they're not allowed to communicate to the media, and they're not allowed to communicate what there may be someone in the audience who asks a question that they don't have a talking point for. And therefore, they will close up. And we've seen this happen even in press conferences that take place in China, when you had these missing ministers. And people in China said, well, where are these ministers? And the spokesperson couldn't answer the question. So if you can't answer the question, you can't communicate, right? I mean, the ability of China to communicate effectively simply doesn't exist. And this is going to continue to harm them more and more. They can't come forward. They can't come out and talk openly in an international forum of any kind. They can only talk when they're comfortable among themselves. The fact that Xi Jinping didn't go to the G20, the fact that he only feels really comfortable when people come to China to see him, but he's very uncomfortable in an equal relationship with anyone. So he doesn't really have to be an equal with anyone other than the United States, and that he's avoiding. So so long as the Chinese have this inability to communicate, and the fact that we're talking about censorship, essentially, a society that practices such deep censorship is not going to prevail in communicating very much of anything. And so they've tied their hands. Now, my friend Zoltan is here, and he and I have been talking about this. There is now something in the world that is going to cause China to basically fail, and that's AI. China cannot use AI. And that's where global knowledge is accumulating at an incredible pace, breathtaking pace. And that's going to be the technology that will cause the system to fail. And there's no way they can harness AI, because AI is based on a global knowledge base in which ideas about democracy, in which our conversation will actually be there tomorrow. But this conversation will not be heard in China, because Chinese AI is going to censor it out. So the knowledge base upon which China will be developing is going to shrink in relationship to the total global knowledge. So the total global knowledge will be in open chat AI, and the Chinese access is blocked completely, censorship, and the Chinese database is actually a shrinking part of the total knowledge of the world. That's going to sink them. And they know it, by the way.
All right, I want to turn now to some audience questions and comments. Please wait for the microphone and share your name if you can. We'll have you go first. Okay. You're on, I think.
Can you hear me? There we go. Hi, my name is Logan West, and I'm a research fellow here at the Danube Institute. With regards to strategic autonomy, smaller powers or middle powers such as Hungary have made an effort to, in a sense, get along with both of the major powers. Such as for Hungary, work both with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as work with the US in the EU through NATO and the European Union. How well do you see that working out in terms of trying to play both sides in a sense?
Do one of you want to answer that, or? I don't see it working out. I don't see how a country can compromise its strategic survival for the purpose of flimsy economic benefits that it may get. That's a suicidal path. I don't see how that can work out, and I don't think it will work out. I think that's an illusion. Hungary is a target of China. Make no doubt about it. Hungary is viewed as a vulnerable country that China can absorb with very little resources. It's a 10 million country. Everything here can be bought by China overnight. The same thing can happen in China that happened in Greece already. So China is targeting Hungary, and I don't see how Hungary will be able to defend itself.
Short question. We're almost out of time. Raise your hand. There you go, Stephen.
Stephen Klimchuk, Danube Institute visiting fellow. Professor Root, thanks very much. Just a quick two-part question. I hope it'll be quick. Regarding Taiwan, which is so important, to what degree do you feel that Taiwan's moral arguments for self-determination have been compromised by the fact that Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists came to Taiwan, changed it, recreated it as the rightful one China, the Republic of China. That's, I think, one question. The other has to do with the fact you've made a very strong case that China's ancient civilization and cultural patterns are quite impervious to outside influences, or at least they want them to be so. I wondered if you might have a view on Hong Kong and Singapore, because I loved old British Hong Kong. It seemed to be an amazing fusion of Chinese culture, Chinese people, with British liberties and rule of law. It worked very well at the time. Likewise, Singapore is different. It seems to be a somewhat more authoritarian Confucian Chinese culture, but still quite pro-Western and has been able to assimilate other Western patterns. Thank you.
So I agree with both of your comments. One, the Chiang Kai-shek legacy, it does create this ambiguity which leads to an irrational basis for the conversation today. I think that the U.S. relationship with Chiang Kai-shek was always very problematic, and the notion of one China and that being, the Chiang Kai-shek government, that was a delusion. That was and so it really has muddied the waters. And has created ambiguity and also to a certain extent hypocrisy. And you're absolutely right. This is why this is a very, very difficult problem to deal with. The second, also you're absolutely right. This is a statement that I often make in China. I'm sure you do as well, that it is of a benefit to China to have Hong Kong and have Taiwan out there, because these are intermediaries that enable China to gain access to funding, to ideas, to technology that they wouldn't otherwise have. So I think it's a very bad policy what they're doing in Hong Kong, not only because I don't like it, but because it's harmful it's dismantling a capability that enabled them to achieve what they've achieved today. Taiwan is indispensable as a source of entrepreneurship in China. Why would you undo that when it's self-inflicted harm? Singapore, another example of a Chinese society that is perfectly capable of being an international part of the world, working effectively with China, and at the same time not being under Chinese control. So the lesson that I draw from both of these is exactly the same lesson that you draw. The question is, why is it that the people in China today don't see what you just said? And that is deeply problematic, that they can't see their own self-advantage the way you and I do.
Well, all right. I have to apologize a bit, ladies and gentlemen, that I mismanaged the time a little bit and didn't leave more time for audience questions and comments, but we have come to the end of our period. John, do you want to make a closing comment, or?
Well, I do, because I think we've been very privileged to have a discussion of the highest order in a very relaxed environment, so to speak, but nonetheless raising vital questions and in the main answering them. Of course, we haven't answered every question you've raised, but that, to my mind, justifies us ensuring that at some point in the future, I hope sooner rather than later, we can arrange this discussion again, perhaps with more time and perhaps more on one occasion, because the interrelationship between Western civilization and the Chinese civilization has obviously got enormous opportunities for fruitful cooperation, and at the moment is leading down, in a way, you're suggesting, two blind alleys simultaneously. And I would throw in one further thought, that if we look at the drawbacks of the Chinese system, it does create circumstances in which clearly failed policies are almost impossible to change until the failure becomes absolutely undeniable. The one-child policy is obviously the example. But the second case is that we seem in the West to be imitating this kind of blindness, as we have done, I think, seriously in the response to COVID, in which, again, the evidence of failure was denied, partly because, as with China, we didn't allow alternative competing views to be openly discussed and argued. And my own feeling is that that's another lesson. I may be fathering that on you without you agreeing with it, but that seems to me to be a cause for anxiety, because if we are in a situation of competition, we really want to stress our strengths rather than adopt their weaknesses, which in some ways we are doing. So I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Root. I want to thank my two colleagues. This has been great fun. It has to happen again. Thank you. I should. Thank you.